In the next moment, you find yourself standing next to Matthew in front of your high school, just as an empty yellow school bus is pulling out of the parking lot. On the ground in front of you lay your backpacks as a couple of kids drive past yelling, "Bye! See you Monday!" Your teacher yells from the doorway of the school, "Do you two need to call your parents for a ride home?" You and Matthew stare at each other for a brief, shocked moment, and finally Matthew yells, "Thanks, Mrs. Caldwell. We're all set." Then looking at you, he says, "Do you remember what I remember?" "You mean the underground base? A solid gold pyramid and teleporting? Though I have no idea how we ended up here," you say. Then you grab Matthew and, hugging him tightly, say, "Yes, I remember everything." When you finally release each other from your marathon hug, Matthew says, "I live just a few blocks away. I'll give you a ride home." "Okay," you say, though you are fairly sure you are dreaming the whole thing. As you walk, you say, "I'm so confused. No one seems to realize that anything happened. I mean, they obviously didn't miss us." "I know," says Matthew. "I can't even think of a single quantum physics principle to explain that." You walk quietly for a few minutes until Matthew stops and says, "This is me." You are standing in front of a completely fenced-in wooded property with an elegant metal gate that swings silently open when Matthew punches in the code. On the other side of the gate is a 3-bedroom white stucco cottage with a gray shingle roof. "Oh, I love this cottage," you say. "Was it built in the 1800s? 1866, says Matthew, smiling. "Do you think your parents are home?" "I'm pretty sure someone will be home, but we live a bit further along the drive," he says. "Oh, I see," you say, now completely unsure of what to expect. The cobblestone driveway winds its way past wooded areas, gardens, lawns, a magnificent greenhouse, and a huge stone carriage house, complete with a clock tower. Finally, you come to a 3-story stone house, with 2 towers standing like sentinels on either side of the front door and the upstairs balcony. "This was originally my great-grandparents' home," says Matthew. Then with a sweeping gesture toward the front door, he says, "Come on in. You can meet the parents," he adds, mysteriously raising one eyebrow. "Does this mean you're taking me on the guided tour?" you say as you venture up the front steps. "Of course," says Matthew as he flings open the front door with a grand gesture. "You can just leave your backpack here on the porch." You set your backpack down and step into the house. The magnificent entrance is a room unto itself, with high ceilings, paneled wood walls, an immense hand-carved fireplace, and hardwood floors beneath Persian rugs, with a stairway rising 3 stories above you. Beyond the stairway, you can see French doors leading into a huge solarium, which overlooks a sweeping lawn and gardens that lead down to a lake with sailboats moored at the dock. In a mock, hushed and ominous tone, Matthew says, "I think we'll start with the darkest, most depressing room. Get it out of the way. I call it the lion's den, since my dad has all of his safari conquests pegged to the mahogany paneling. He likes it dark and gloomy to reflect his mood." You walk through a paneled library with floor-to-ceiling bookcases, a fireplace, and a huge bay window. Matthew opens the double doors leading into the den and exclaims, "I don't believe it." The room is full of light. In place of wood paneling, the walls are painted a soft sandy color and lined with white molding. There are no animal heads or skins, no guns hanging on the walls. Instead, there are potted orchids in a variety of colors and delicate watercolor paintings. The room is decorated with beautiful white furniture and glass tables with a thick pastel Persian rug in the center of the room. "This is it?" you say.
"Apparently, Mother did some fast redecorating,"
says Matthew incredulously.
"Unbelievable."
At that moment, Mrs. McKinley enters the room. She looks considerably younger than you would have expected and is wearing a tennis outfit with her long, light brown hair up in a ponytail. Smiling affably, she says, "What's unbelievable?"
"Oh, hi, Mom,"
says Matthew, introducing you to his mother. She greets you with a broad smile and says,
"It's a rare treat that I get to meet any of Matthew's friends." Mom, I was wondering how you managed to redecorate this room so quickly."
Mrs. McKinley laughs and says,
"What on earth are you talking about? This room hasn't been redecorated since you were 10 years old."
Matthew looks at you, then back at his mother, and says,
"All right then. Tell me where the safari animals are and all of Dad's guns."
His mother pauses for a moment, looking intently at Matthew.
"Are you feeling all right, honey?"
she says as she puts her hand on his forehead.
"Yeah,"
he replies.
"Why?"
A bit puzzled, she says,
"Well, you know your father hasn't touched a gun in his life. He can't bear to see an animal harmed. The only time he ever shoots an animal is with his camera."
Then turning to you, she says warmly,
"Would you like to see the animals his father shoots?"
You nod, and she leads you into a long hallway with windows on one side overlooking the lake. The opposite wall is lined with spectacular pictures of animals and wildflowers from around the world. Mrs. McKinley says proudly,
"Matthew's father took every one of these pictures.
He's traveled all over the world, and this year there's going to be a wildlife calendar composed exclusively of his work." Enthusiastically, you say, "He's fantastic!" Matthew whispers to you,
"I've never seen these pictures in my life."
You walk quietly down the hall, exchanging puzzled glances, as Matthew's mother leads you outside. His father is leaning over the garden when his wife waves and yells, "Darling, look who's here!" He straightens up with a bouquet of flowers in his hands and smiles broadly. With long, swift strides, he heads toward you. He's vibrantly healthy, with a glowing complexion and rosy cheeks like Matthew's. His eyes sparkle as he hugs Matthew and says,
"It's great to have you home, son."
Matthew introduces you to his father. Mr. McKinley smiles graciously and hands you an exquisite yellow rose and says,
"I'm delighted to meet you."
Then he says confidentially,
"I have to cheat a little in the spring. These flowers are from the greenhouse."
He then hands his wife a bouquet of multicolored tulips and says sweetly,
"These are for you, my angel."
Mrs. McKinley hugs him and whispers, "I love you so much." Mr. McKinley winks at you and says unabashed,
"This is what it's like to be on a honeymoon for 22 years.
You smile and Matthew says,
"We really should get going. It's been an awfully long trip."
"Lovely to meet you," says Mrs. McKinley.
"Come back any time,"
says Matthew's father gregariously. As you head back to the house, you glance over your shoulder. and see Matthew's parents strolling through the garden with their arms around each other. "Your parents are really in love with each other," you say. Matthew shakes his head slowly and says, "I don't understand. I've never heard him say a kind word to my mother, let alone pick flowers for her." He looks at you intently and says, "My father has been sick for years. He was skinny and pale a few days ago. Now he weighs at least 20 pounds more. He's healthy and happy, and my mom has always had short hair and dark circles under her eyes. She's never been athletic in any way." As you walk out the front door, Matthew grabs your backpack, leads you down the steps and across the driveway. He opens the door of his red 1967 convertible Corvette for you. You climb in, and he closes your door, then throws your pack behind the seats. "No trunk," he says with a grin. "I have no idea who came up with that idea." As he starts the engine, he says, "All right, let's see if there are any surprises at your house." You laugh and wonder the same thing as you drive into the countryside and arrive at a quaint ranch-style log cabin. You lead Matthew in through the screened-in porch and through the back door to the mudroom. "Hi, Dad, I'm home," you yell. Your mother pushes through the swinging doors that lead into the kitchen and says, "What, you don't say hi to your mother anymore?" Your mother is tall and beautiful, with a glowing complexion and smiling deep blue eyes. "Oh, hi, Mom. I just didn't expect you to be here," you say, slightly taken aback. Your mother laughs and says, "Well, I live here, don't I? Where else would I be?" Puzzled, you say, Mom, this is Matthew." "Hello, Matthew. Why don't you come into the kitchen? I'm teaching this young lady's father how to make applesauce." She looks at Matthew, smiles, and says with a wink, "We're an equal opportunity household." You all step into the kitchen, and there is your father, perched on a stool, wearing a frilly Christmas apron while he pares apples. You smile broadly at your dad as you introduce Matthew. "All right, I don't want either of you laughing at my brush with domestication," says your father. "I pledged to your mother I'd do whatever she wanted for our 20th anniversary. And look what she has me doing." He dumps a pile of sliced apples into a big pot on the stove and adds with a grin, "Ah, the cost of true love." Your mother wraps her arms around him lovingly, kisses him on the cheek, and says, "What dedication." Your father winks at Matthew and says slyly with a twinkle in his eye, "When you get married, son, never underestimate the fringe benefits of understanding and complying with the marital chain of command." Going slightly pink over your dad bringing up the subject of marriage with Matthew, you giggle awkwardly and deftly change the subject. "Dad, are you going to let us sample the finished product?" you say, grinning. "Sure, this should be done in about half an hour. In the meantime, why don't you take Matthew down to the pond?" "Okay," you say. You and Matthew hold hands as you walk down the lawn behind your house. Matthew smiles, raises his eyebrows, and says innocently, "Anything different at your house?" You laugh and shake your head. "Are you kidding? 3 days ago, or something like that, my parents were thoroughly divorced. They've been living in separate houses for over a year. On top of that, they look more like they did in their wedding picture 20 years ago. And my dad has never had a sense of humor in his life." Sitting next to each other on a small hill overlooking the pond, with weeping willows dotting the edges and a small waterfall directly across from you, you look directly into Matthew's eyes and say, "I have to confess something. I know we must have done something to bring this about, but I have no idea what it is." Matthew smiles and says, "I've been thinking about this, and what's happening strangely ties in with some quantum theories. Of course, I can't prove anything, but I can tell you what I know." "Please do," you say enthusiastically. One of the latest theories in quantum physics is called MIW, which stands for Many Interacting Worlds. The theory is mathematical and on the quantum level, but if it's true, in the infinitesimally small world of the microcosm, then it should be true in the macrocosm, which would be our world. Anyhow, the idea is that for a long time, quantum reality has been regarded as energy moving in waves. But MIW suggests that rather than being a wave, quantum reality is a collection of parallel worlds. But they aren't linear, they're more like bubbles. And many scientists are now beginning to believe in the existence of hidden universes. But that gets us into what Einstein referred to as spooky quantum entanglement, says Matthew, laughing. And, well, that would be like way too much information. You laugh. "Okay, give me the for dummies version." "I can do that," says Matthew, smiling. "Imagine that each game player is playing in their own bubble. Or better yet, think of yourself playing on the surface of a bubble." "Okay," you say hesitantly. So every player is floating around in their own little bubble of reality. And sometimes these bubbles come together and stay there for any length of time, and then they detach and float away. Some come back together regularly, and some you never see again. And that's kind of the idea of many interacting worlds. That makes sense, but I still don't understand what caused everything to change. I mean, if we're floating around on interactive bubbles, why did everything in our bubbles change? And why do we know there was a change, but no one else realizes it? Matthew shakes his head. "I haven't quite figured that out yet. But you know those entangled particles I mentioned? Well, the idea is that particles remain connected, so that even when an action is performed on one particle, it instantly affects the other particle as well, even when they're separated by great distances." You think for a moment and say, "Well, then how could time and space be real?" Matthew nods. "Exactly. Time and space are just illusions. And I think that's why Einstein called it spooky," he says, laughing. Matthew sits quietly for a moment and says, "Do you think this has anything to do with your trip to the inner earth? I know I'm grasping here, but it's all I can think of. I mean, you didn't tell me much about it." "Well, they have this library called the Portal, and get this. It has 456 square miles of storage underground and not a single book." "What kind of library has no books?" You smile mischievously and say, "Everything is stored in crystals." You sit in a chair, ask a question in your mind, and instantly you're shown whatever you need to know. And you can go anywhere in the universe with just the intention to go. "Anywhere in the universe?" says Matthew, amazed. Where did you go?
You smile and say, I didn't go anywhere. I came back for you. Matthew wraps his arms around you, and you feel yourself dissolving into him as he bends down to kiss you. More than anything, you had longed for this moment. You're both home, you're together, and finally you're not facing some life or death situation. But still, the moment is bittersweet. It seemed so unfair that you had to choose between the man you loved and living someplace you had only ever dreamed of. Why couldn't you have both? Sensing your feeling of loss, Matthew says,
Well, we'll just have to go there and do some traveling together.
With a slightly pained smile, you say, I'm afraid we can never go there. There's an entrance at the North Pole, but there's no way back in, at least not for us.
My family has plenty of money. That stupid car I have in the driveway is what my dad gave me when I told him I just wanted a used car and that I didn't want to stand out in the school parking lot. The car my dad gave me is a 1967 L88 Corvette. Only 20 of them were made, and the car is worth over $4 million. That's why I walked to school.
He says, shaking his head and rolling his eyes.
I would be so happy to sell the car, and my father would know how to set up an expedition.
You're so sweet, you say with a sigh. It's just not that easy. There are powerful people who don't want anyone to know this other world exists. And when people try to go or set up an expedition, they're stopped by military planes.
What could you possibly be worried about?
Says a sweet child's voice. Asha! You and Matthew exclaim at once. Oh my God, are we dead or about to die or something? You say, wide-eyed. Asha tilts her head back and laughs.
You live in a new world, and new rules apply.
Well, where do you live when you're not appearing out of nowhere? You say.
Oh,
says the little girl, laughing merrily.
I'm multidimensional. I am wherever I think myself into being.
You and Matthew look at each other and burst out laughing. Okay, you say, shaking your head and quickly changing the topic. So tell us what happened. Nothing's the same. We don't even know how we made it out of the base. And what happened to the days and time and everything? You say, your words unable to keep up with your thoughts. Asha giggles.
Don't you remember what you wished for?
What wish? You say. Asha looks at you silently. Oh, you mean that crazy wish where I was going to save the earth? The one where I was supposed to wish without worrying? Asha smiles and says,
Well, did you worry?
You burst out laughing as you think of everything that happened after you left the portal. No, I was kind of busy. Actually, I forgot all about it. But wait a minute. I was supposed to find someone else and help them first. I never did that part.
Yes, you did,
says Asha, waiting patiently for you to remember. Who? Who did I help? There's no one else crazy enough to think they could save the earth and people.
And the bees?
Says Asha knowingly. Taken aback, you say, You're talking about Thomas. I didn't try to help him.
But you did,
says Asha.
But that doesn't explain what happened at the pyramid, or how we ended up back here, or why our families are completely different,
says Matthew incredulously.
You're both still playing the game,
says Asha.
But you're in an alternate parallel reality. that has never been part of the program before.
But how did that happen?
As you remember, every player in the game has the same amount of power. But the reason it appears that some players are more powerful than others is because most of the players have been coerced into giving their power away through fear,
says Asha.
The high priests knew this and cooked up every fear-based institution, government, the monarchy, war, religion, politics, education, and their most brilliant creation, money. As Alex, you saw this coming. You knew the high priests were going to stay in their bodies and take control for thousands of years. And that's why you built the pyramids in Egypt. The priests never guessed that the true purpose of the pyramids was to allow hundreds or thousands of people to stand at the base and look up at the apex, simultaneously gathering everyone's focused thoughts and intentions into one place. And this conscious unity was the one thing that could instantly stop the high priest's domination of Earth. But as Alex, you envisioned far more than that. You envisioned all players playing the game of their choice with like-minded players, and without interference or domination, something that has never happened before in the history of the game.
Why hasn't that happened before? You ask curiously.
Even the most well-practiced players tend to get stuck in duality, seeing other players as right or wrong, good or bad, worthy of punishment or praise. Instead, just like the Vedras, your vision included everyone.
But how did that ball of light appear? Asks Matthew, dumbfounded.
The human avatar body has electrical currents throughout every cell, all of which have the strength of lightning. And each cell produces light from its DNA, which means your bodies are literally swimming in an ocean of light. When all of you gathered together in a circle around the pyramid and began singing, you created a symmetry of mathematics, what you might call a perfect circle of sound. The light you saw was very similar to atomic energy.
But what's the math part, you say?
Math is everywhere,
says Asha merrily.
But in this case, without realizing it, everyone surrounding the pyramid was singing at 528 hertz, which is mathematically consistent with nature and the universe.
What does that mean? You ask.
Well, if you think of music as the universal language and love as the universal healer, you were all singing in the key of love. 528 hertz is the same tone that emanates from the sun. It's the frequency of chlorophyll, and therefore the frequency of every green growing thing. It's the tone emanating from the middle of the rainbow, which is green, and the sound emanating from the human heart. So this perfect circle of sound, along with the atomic energy above the apex, activated the gold pyramid and eliminated planetary dissonance by regenerating the original harmony, the original sound frequency that created the game in the first place. And in the same way that your DNA has a unique frequency that identifies you in every game you play, no matter where or when, the game takes place in countless different dimensional realities, what you might call parallel worlds, with each dimension vibrating and creating its own unique music. So in the simplest terms, your musical celebration tapped into the science and mathematics of love, literally vibrating your inner awareness of life as you choose it to be into physical reality. And when you both combined your thought force with everyone else focusing at the apex of the pyramid, you were no longer focused on other people's version of reality. In other words, you both stopped adding your power to someone else's creation and started creating, imagining the world you wanted to see. And that's how both of you changed the entire programming of the game forever.
But why did just the two of us remember what happened? Says Matthew. We saw our teacher and some of the kids from our camping trip, but we're the only ones who seem to know that anything happened. Looking back and forth between you and Matthew with a knowing look and a suppressed smile, Asha says,
A long time ago, Plato said this: when one of them meets his other half, the actual half of himself, the pair are lost in an amazement of love and friendship and intimacy, and one will not be out of the other's sight, even for a moment. And that's the part of the game you love and hate the most. You love it when you find each other, and you hate it when you spend a lifetime looking for each other. You two are like the embodiment of spooky quantum entanglement. You can't be separated, not by time, space, or game lifetimes.
Looking at you, Asha says,
So when you felt deeply connected to the Vedras, Matthew instantly felt the same way. You will both always experience what the other is experiencing, even if you aren't fully conscious of it.
So, do you think I can tell people about the Vedras and they'll actually listen? You say, hopefully. Asha looks directly at you and smiles, but she doesn't say a word. Matthew reaches out and holds your hand as you smile at him. Asha, I know this is impossible, but I really want to go back to the inner earth, and I want Matthew to see it too, you say.
Impossible? Nothing's impossible, for goodness sake,
says the little girl, blinking incredulously.
Do you really think that the intelligence that created the human avatar body needs the Montauk chair or some other device to travel? Don't you remember anything about being Alex? You know, all the teleporting and science of imagery. And now it's even easier because you're not in the third dimension anymore. Wish without worrying, says Asha as her body begins to shimmer. You can go anywhere in an instant and come back too.
And then she was gone. You and Matthew look at each other. But before either can say a word, the dinner bell rings out loudly on the porch. Your father shouts, "Homemade applesauce! Are you guys coming?" "Yeah, Dad," you yell back. "You and Mom go ahead and get started. We'll be there in a few minutes." "All right, sweetheart. Take your time. We're making dinner. There's no rush." You look at Matthew and hold your hands out. He takes your hands in his, and you say, "There's only one way to find out if we really have access to the inner earth." "I'm ready," says Matthew. Then dropping your hands, he wraps his arms tightly around you and adds, "But I'm not taking any chances." You hold Matthew and say, "I'll imagine the inner earth, and you imagine coming with me." You both close your eyes, and you envision the place you first saw on your inner earth compass. There is no feeling of movement, but even before you open your eyes, you feel the moisture in the air. Then you hear flocks of birds singing their evening songs. You both open your eyes to hundreds of different species in the treetops, and high overhead like a living rainbow that has splintered off into tiny colorful flecks darting through the air. You and Matthew are holding each other exactly as you were a moment earlier. But now you are standing on a grassy knoll with an ancient stand of towering sequoias behind you. You both look down in awe at the sparkling ocean below, then look back at each other. Yelping with joy, you jump into Matthew's arms, wrapping your arms around his neck and your legs around his waist. "I didn't lose you!"
"Nope,"
he says, smiling warmly. "And my dad said we could take our time."
"Yep,"
says Matthew with mock seriousness.
"I think it's very important to obey your parents. And he did say, don't rush."
You lean in and whisper in Matthew's ear, "I think we have all the time in the world."